talk about some efforts that my colleague Eric Lachapelle and our colleague Eric Motivé have done, adapting some survey items that operationalize some core concepts in an important theory of risk perception to the Canadian context. So that theory of risk perception is the cultural theory of risk perception, which has roots that go back to the 1980s. So the first thing to get off the table is when talking about cultural theory of risk perception, we're actually not talking about culture in the kind of the ethnicity or nation-state sense. And I think it's important to point out because Roxana is on the panel, and I think that's sort of more of the framework that she's working in. So we're talking more about kind of political culture. So the roots are with an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, who did classic ethnographic field studies in Africa and devised a cultural theory that was related to kind of risks and taboos in tribal societies. And she basically argued that societies have to make two fundamental decisions. They have to decide how they're going to divide themselves on a grid dimension. So how regimented is their community going to be with a lot of strict role differentiation, or the opposite, is it going to be kind of a flatly organized society? And then they have to decide to what extent are individuals going to be autonomous decision makers, or to what extent are individuals going to be embedded in the community. And that's the group dimension. So she joined up with the political scientist Aaron Wildowski in the 1980s for a collaboration to take this theory and apply it to industrialized societies for the express purpose of trying to explain why people were becoming so concerned about environmental issues at a time, particularly with risks from technology, as people were living longer and safer lives. And so the purpose was to try to make sense of the rise of 1970s and 1980s environmentalism. So basically the guts of the theory are that based on the interaction of these two core dimensions, the group and the grid dimension, you end up with four kinds of types of worldviews that can emerge that people adhere to. You can be an egalitarian, which is low grid and high group, a hierarch, which is high grid and high group, a fatalist, which is high grid but low group, and an individualist, which is low group and low grid. The terms are fairly self-explanatory. It's been used a fair bit. One particular variant of it that emerged in the kind of the mid-2000s is affiliated with Dan Kahan, and it's known as cultural cognition theory. The slight twist is that rather than there being kind of four discrete rather than there be kind of four discrete worldviews in each of these quadrants, it's a two-dimensional kind of theory. So individuals at the individual level make a decision about to what extent where they fall here on the grid dimension and where they fall here on this group dimension, and then based on those kinds of commitments that each individual makes, risk perceptions flow from that via the use of kind of psychological heuristics. So this is the motivated reasoning part. So people then, they assimilate information from experts in a biased kind of way that kind of basically accords with their already pre-existing value commitments that they have made on these two dimensions. So it's been used, this theory has been used to really pretty impressive empirical success, trying to explain why there's debates about whether the Earth is warming, what the scientific consensus on climate change is, what the relative risks of things like nanotechnology are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really this variation on cultural theory in the mid-2000s associated with Dan Kahan has really kind of given cultural theory in general a new lease on life, as it were. Independently, so then Dan has developed a series of survey items which he argues, and I think persuasively, at least in the United States context, measure these two group and grid dimensions. So the top 6 survey items measure the grid dimension, and then the bottom 6 measure the group dimension, and they're sort of standard psychological scales with Likert items turned into numerical values, and they've been validated through a lot of testing, at least in the United States context. context. So independently, Eric Lachapelle and Eric Monpetit and myself and another researcher have tried to use these survey items to see to what extent these also measure group and grid dimensions in the Canadian context and to what extent they can be linked to variations in risk perception in the Canadian context. There's the citations for 3 different studies. This one was on risk perception of biofuels. This was on expert credibility and framing on, Eric, which technology did you guys do? Different technologies, right? Fracking, wind, I thought?
Climate change, and cell phone.
And this was a survey that we did on people's perception of risk from fluoridation in the region of Waterloo. So surprisingly, we found, I'm not going to go into this actually, we found that the 12 survey items that in the United States context did seem to kind of measure 2 non-correlated distinct dimensions, the group and the grid dimension. They didn't do that in the Canadian context. And we were obviously very surprised by this, given the similarities in the day-to-day life. In Canada, you'd think that the survey items would just kind of transport well into the Canadian context. And at least in the way that those 12 items that I showed you, the way that they related to each other, there were some important and substantial differences in Canada that we wanted to explore, and we've done that. So we used some SSHRC funding that we had to commission some focus groups to talk to people about how they viewed these kind of survey items, some of the others that we developed ourselves, and then we developed a large-scale survey where we tested 23 different Likert items that were all trying to measure different variations and different conceptions of these group and grid affiliation. And we deployed that in the spring of 2014, I think, and I'm going to show you some of the results from that, because it's going to show how cultural theory in Canada can still be used to explain variation of risk perception, albeit not the cultural cognition variation that Dan Kahan has been using in the United States. These are the 23 questions that we used, grouped into 3 different categories. We kind of pared those down into 12 different scales of 3 questions each. So we chose to kind of go the 4 kind of quadrant route, measuring 4 distinct worldviews rather than the 2-dimensional route that Dan Kahan uses. It seemed to make sense more in the Canadian context. So that's how we measure egalitarianism. We need to do more to reduce inequalities between men and women. Discrimination against visible minorities is still a very serious problem in our society. Dramatically reduce inequalities between the rich and the poor. A hierarchy, it's about to kind of your preference for a regimented society or not. Individualism, the extent to which individuals should be autonomous decision makers, and then fatalists, who are people who kind of lack a sense of efficacy or control over individual or collective affairs. This is probably the most substantial part of our finding. So in the survey, not only did we ask those questions trying to measure the group and grid affiliation, but we also asked people to rate the risks of, I guess about 10 or 11 different kind of concerns or issues in the world, grouped loosely under the rubric of technologies, social deviation, deviant behavior, and one kind of population growth that we just kind of threw in there because we wanted to test and see how that played. So again, remembering that the point of cultural theory was to sort of explain the rise of concerns about environmental risks posed by technologies. So here, this is our egalitarian score, our egalitarian scale. And so you can see climate change, GMOs. It goes from 0 is no risk, 10 is extreme risk. So climate change, the more egalitarian you are, the more greater risk from climate change. GMOs, pesticides, no relationship with vaccines there. Significant relationship between egalitarianism and fracking, nuclear power. But if you look at the sort of the deviant behavior items, marijuana, arguably the more egalitarian you are, the less risk you see from marijuana, fair enough. Islamic terrorism, gangs, prostitution, moderate relationship with population growth. And then if you contrast that with hierarchy, you get a pretty clear relationship here: marijuana, Islamic terrorism, gangs, prostitution. Individualism and fatalism are less revealing, but there are still some interesting points here. So you get, in the individualism item, you get, where is it? So here, if you look here at how individualism differs from egalitarianism, you see here egalitarianism is associated with a slight fear or perception of risk of prostitution. That disappears with individualism. Fatalism, also less revealing, although this is an interesting one here. The more fatalist you are, the greater risk that you perceive from vaccines. There's a lot in that, but those are kind of the major highlights. Cultural cognition associated with Dan Kahan at Yale is one variant of a broader cultural theory. We found independently in 3 separate studies some important questions about the extent to which the surveyed items can reliably and validly be simply deployed into the Canadian cultural context. That is still, to be honest, a little bit of a mystery to me. I won't speak for Eric, but it's a bit of a mystery to me. We've developed some survey questions that are sensitive to the Canadian context, that are rooted in qualitative research and have been gone through a series of kind of tests. And initial results suggest that these are highly correlated in theoretically predicted ways with patterns of risk perception. So what to do? So to link this back to kind of the theme of the panel of motivated reasoning and risk perception, I mean, essentially this suggests that risk perception goes along with political commitments. So now that poses challenges for communicating scientific information, which is ostensibly factual in nature, because part of the process of motivated reasoning means that people will discount facts and scientific information if it doesn't sort of fit with their pre-existing political, cultural commitments. So this highly complicates the risk communication and the risk management environment. So perhaps that's not all that surprising to the people in this room, but I think we can present here some useful survey tools that can help us shed light on precisely what the conditions are when that happens, the mechanisms that make that happen, perhaps how that could be muted, and so on, that again, I would say, that are rooted in a sensitivity to the Canadian context. So I'll stop there, and thank you.